lumber company actually brought the industrial age into this valley because we were nothing more than hunters and people that grew crops for livelihoods. So when the lumber company came in, people had jobs.
Around the year 1900, Colonel W.B. Townsend came here from Pennsylvania to buy 86,000 acres of land full of rich virgin forest in what's now Smoky Mountain National Park. The next year, he and his partner started the Little River Lumber Company, with plans for building a railroad to carry lumber from the mountains down to the mill. This little museum in his namesake town shares the history of how a lumber mill and its railroad led to both prosperity in the valley and devastation in the forest. David Hazell is one of the volunteers.
The railroad here went from Walland, which is 7 miles downriver, to here where the mill was at this site in Townsend, and then went from Townsend up to both Elkmont and Tremont to gather the logs there, bring them to the mill, and then they'd be sawn in the mill and be stickered and dried or go to a kiln for drying, and then they would go all over the United States.
Inside the original Walland Railroad Station are numerous artifacts and photographs from the company's glory days, including the station manager's office.
That's Elbert, and Elbert would sit there and he would hand the directions or the instructions to an engineer going by on a train, and if you saw that little flycatcher stick that he had in his hand, he would hold that out and it would have a piece of a string across it with a paper in the middle that had the instructions. And the traveling engineer passing by would grab that. The string would, ideally, the string would come off and he'd have his instructions where to stop and where to wait for another train to go by.
On the grounds is a rare 70-ton geared Shay locomotive, a workhorse of the lumber industry.
So a lot of folks come from Europe, from Switzerland, from Australia, from different countries to see this type of locomotive because they simply don't exist in areas outside of the United States.
The small locomotive was used as an engine to operate a mill on site up in the mountains. Townsend's Lumber Company laid about 150 miles of rails into the mountains, and as years passed, the colonel even envisioned another way to profit from them. It's funny, but those same trains that carried lumber out of the mountains were soon carrying visitors into the mountains to escape the summer heat and pollution. This is a resort enclave called Daisy Town, which may have been a precursor to something called tourism.
Well, Mr. Townsend was essential in starting tourism by offering the train as a mode of transportation to come and stay at one of the cabins up at Elkmont, or stay in the Wonderland Hotel, which was a great place to stay there in Elkmont as well.
Around 1910, Townsend started selling land to individuals at what's now the Elkmont Campground. First came the Appalachian Club, then the private summer cottages. It was a true playground for the well-to-do of East Tennessee. And the only way to get there was by train. Townsend's trains, of course.
A lot of the folks who were just wanted to go along and maybe couldn't afford to ride in a covered car would have the option to ride in an open car. And a lot of times they'd wear white because it'd be a weekend trip up there and back, and people dressed pretty formally. But in most cases, they would end up with a layer of coal ash on their white shirts if they had to ride in the open cars.
During the 1920s, Elkmont was birthplace of the National Park movement. Eventually, all Smoky Mountain property owners were forced to sell and move. And the cottages, well, they were sold at half price in exchange for lifetime leases, all of which expired in 2002. Today, Daisy Town is a ghost town and a popular stop for visitors who want to explore an era when logging and tourism briefly coexisted. And the Little River Museum is a worthy companion destination, one that uncovers much of the Smoky Mountains pre-National Park history. A perilous time for this now public-owned gift of nature.